Reboot is a Canadian animated series that initially aired on YTV in Maple Syrup Land and on ABC in the United States. First premiering in 1994, this series broke ground immediately by being one of the first fully animated CGI television shows ever produced. Heck, this was even before Toy Story hit the theaters in 1995, so to call Reboot ahead of its time is an understatement. The series was developed in good old Vancouver by Mainframe Entertainment, a newly founded company at the time, created by Gavin Blair, Ian Pearson, Phil Mitchell, and John Grace. This team was looking to produce the first CGI television show after using said technology to make the music videos for Dire Straits' Money for Nothing and Def Leppard's Let's Get Rocked. While they weren't technically the first CGI show, because a few other shows like VeggieTales beat them to the punch, Reboot was still very groundbreaking for how it took a much deeper, more mature science fiction story and still made it accessible to kids. This made Reboot a series very akin to things like Batman the Animated Series or Avatar The Last Airbender, which both use the format of a children's show to tell very mature stories. And yes, I'm aware that I just compared Reboot to two of the greatest animated series of all time, and I stand by that high praise. In fact, while the show certainly has a cult following, I think it deserves to be ranked more often among the all-time greats. The best way to demonstrate why this is by covering every episode one after the other. This has also led me to consider how each episode of Reboot stacks up against each other when ranking them against one another. Spoilers are kind of unavoidable while reviewing every episode of a series, so fair warning. If you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend getting caught up on Reboot. And no, we're not covering the Guardian Code in this video because that thing doesn't exist. And if it does, then it's a topic for another day. Same with the PS1 game. Also, we're not covering the Hulu sitcom called Reboot for you smartasses in the comments. Anyway, this is ranking every episode of Reboot, the animated series, from worst to best, starting from the beginning and working our way to the end.
Reboot!
Being the first episode of the series, this episode is meant to establish the characters, setting, and type of plots we will come to expect throughout the show. If you want a lowdown on what the show is about, this is one of those series that explains everything you need to know in the opening credits. Still, to summarize, Bob is a guardian who is sent to the city of Mainframe to protect its residents from incoming games, as well as malicious viruses. He spends most of his time with Dot, who runs a popular diner, as well as her little brother Enzo. We're also introduced to the main antagonist of this series, Megabyte, whose ultimate goal is to gain access to the supercomputer where Bob is from and infect it. The plot of this episode explores the main dynamic, with Megabyte finding a huge tear, which he plans to use as a pathway to said computer. Pretty straightforward, but this is the first episode of a series after all, so a straightforward story is expected and welcome. We spend a lot of time not only establishing the characters, but also at the locations, as we are taken to Dot's diner, Megabyte's lair, and inside of a GameCube input by the user. And yes, they are actually called GameCubes, so suck it Nintendo, you can't sue for this one. The GameCubes take the sprites into a game where everyone who enters becomes a non-playable character. If the sprites fail to stop the user, then everyone within the GameCube's reach is turned into a slug-like creature called a null. Despite being mostly focused on world building and character setup, this first episode does contain a lot of action and humor, which are both staples of the show as a whole. This is best demonstrated in the opening action sequence, where Bob is being chased by Hack and Slash, Megabyte's two bumbling henchmen. The humor of this show is a good mix of slapstick, which will appeal to kids, and referential humor that will go over their heads. Sure, a kid may get a reference to Pong or Star Wars, which this episode contains, but other parts of this episode reference things like George Lucas's first film, THX 1138, which I doubt any 90s kid will get. I'm not going to point out every reference that the show makes, but if you are looking for that, check out the series Every Reference in Reboot by YouTuber Cameron O'Hara, link in the video description. Even the action sequences surprisingly still hold up after all these years. You would think that the animation for this show would feel dated, but okay, it kinda does, but not in a bad way. If you really think about it, the context of the animation makes perfect sense, given the fact that this show is about computer programs and video games. This is what video games looked like in the 90s, so if anything, the primitive animation adds to the experience and makes it feel more authentic. Granted, there are a lot of uncomfortable close-up shots on some characters, but that might have been just a trend of the 90s if Space Jam is anything to go by. Overall, this is a very solid foundation for the series. It does feel a little bit basic in the story department, but the action, world building, humor, and character interactions are all well established here. There are a few rushed moments, like when Bob thwarts Megabyte's plans by simply kicking over his computer, but those are few and far between. It might not be the most memorable episode of the series, or the season for that matter, but it does a good job at setting up the bowling pins so that subsequent episodes can knock them down. This episode follows Enzo starting his own delivery service when he gets a request from Megabyte to deliver a package to the other prominent virus in mainframe, hexadecimal. Unbeknownst to him, the package is actually a face mask disguised as a bomb that Megabyte wanted to use to delete hexadecimal. While the first episode was much more character-focused, the subsequent episode focuses a lot more on action. The title Racing the Clock gives us a good idea on what to expect this time around. This is an episode that focuses on Enzo a lot more, which is a good idea because he wasn't in the first episode that much. I really like the chemistry between Enzo and Megabyte here. It kinda reminds me of the dynamic between Scar and Simba from The Lion King, with the former being very manipulative, and playing into the latter's desire to be brave. Tony Jay's voice acting for Megabyte also sounds a little bit like a cross between Jeremy Irons as Scar and Jim Cummings as Robotnik, which makes me wish he was still alive to do a cover of Be Prepared. But what's even more significant than that is this episode also marks the introduction of my absolute favorite character on Reboot, Hexadecimal. Living in the district of Lost Angles, which is a 10 out of 10 pun I must say, Hexadecimal is a telekinetic virus who controls the nulls in mainframe. This crazy bitch gave me nightmares as a kid, and even watching her today still sends chills down my spine. Even so, I could never help but be fascinated by what she was doing. I especially love her theme music, voice acting, and the way she portrays her emotions through different masks. I also enjoy how Megabyte is trying to delete Hexadecimal due to seeing her as competition. Beyond that, this episode once again has a really great mix between action and humor. This must be one of the first CGI racing action sequences ever produced, and it's really fun. Not because it still looks great as a technological achievement, but because the pace is brisk and there's some really great intense moments. I also enjoy how we were able to see what happens when a game is corrupted in this episode. It's actually kind of mind-blowing and a great climax. I think I prefer this episode to the first one because it feels less like we're setting up the series and more like we're having some fun. Even the character interactions that were here I found more entertaining than what was in the first episode. Also, this was the introduction of Hexadecimal. Enough said.
He's trapped! He's trapped! Yeah!
I don't think so.
Megabyte obtains a dangerous magnet, which he plans to use to access the supercomputer. Bob prevents this from happening by stealing the magnet, but is thrown off when the magnet attaches itself to Dot, thus putting her life in danger.
Fucking magnets! How do they work?
This is my favorite episode so far, as in my opinion, it's the best mix of action, humor, character moments, and world building we've gotten so far. Not only do we get a lot of great moments with Bob, Dot, Enzo, and Megabyte, side characters like Cecil and Fong are also given a lot more time to breathe here. On top of that, this episode introduces probably my two favorite comic relief characters on the entire series, those being Al and Al's waiter,
Hear that, Al? What?
who run a diner on level 31 of Mainframe. Al's waiter operates the front of the restaurant and talks very slowly, while Al himself is an unseen off-screen presence who responds to everything with his iconic catchphrase, "What?" I don't even care that it's the same setup and punchline every time. The incredibly slow speech, followed by the blunt off-screen exclamation, always gets me. Beyond that, the scene in Al's wait and eat is great, as we get to see some of the other Mainframe residents, like the Numbers, who make really dumb but amusing dad jokes.
I've been waiting for this since I was 4!
The first two acts of this episode are a little bit slower and more focused on world building, aside from the opening chase sequence that is, but the third act of this episode gives us by far the most engaging and thrilling game sequence so far. This is a good time to bring up that I've been watching the 4K upscaled versions of these episodes, which look really great, and I would recommend checking out if you plan on watching or rewatching this show. Also, when you consider this season was produced in 1994, before 3D video games were even the norm, these game sequences are even more impressive. I think Reboot may have even predicted how certain games like Medieval or Panzer's Dragoon were going to look and play through this episode specifically. All in all, another really solid episode in the bag. Definitely a very humor-focused episode that includes everything from running gags, cultural references, computer puns, fourth wall breaking jokes, and dad jokes. The humor in this show may not be to everyone's taste, but I really enjoy it and appreciate the creators giving us a wide variety of jokes that both kids and adults can appreciate. The action sequences are also very engaging to this day, despite the dated technology, which I've brought up before. That to me is an indication that there was actual artistry behind the show's action sequences, and Reboot was never just the sum of its technological achievements.
Very, very sad. I'll have to destroy you all.
Now we get to another Megabyte vs. Hexadecimal episode, this one involving the former stealing a dangerous bug from the latter that turns everyone in Mainframe into stone. This is with the exception of Hexadecimal, who made it herself, and Bob, whose Guardian code overrides it. This episode really defines what the difference between the two viruses are. While Megabyte does what he does for power, Hexadecimal simply gets a sick sense of fun out of causing chaos. She wasn't necessarily planning on destroying Mainframe here, but at the same time, the city's safety wasn't her biggest concern, until she realized she unintentionally caused world peace by turning everyone into stone. This episode also includes a fight scene between the two viruses, which is really great and a fun way to demonstrate what they're both capable of physically. And yes, Hexadecimal's scary face still lives on forever in my nightmares. Her color-changing eyes add to the threat, and I also like how they change with her mask depending on her emotion. If you look at early CGI shows like Donkey Kong Country or Monster by Mistake, the animation is unintentionally scary. The animation during Hexadecimal scenes is intentionally scary, and making it a bit dated makes it even scarier. Despite this, we do see in the episode that Hexadecimal has somewhat of a heart, especially when she gets emotional from turning her adorable sidekick Scuzzy into stone. This proves that, while certainly destructive, Hexadecimal is nowhere near as evil as Megabyte. I really like the contrast of these two characters a lot. This is easily my favorite episode of the season so far, mostly due to Hexadecimal getting a larger role and showcasing more of her powers. Even though this is the first episode without a game, it never feels dull due to the incredibly high stakes and the great character interactions between Bob, Megabyte, and Hexadecimal. Cameos from Alan as waiter are appreciated too. We also get a lot more Frisket in this episode, who is Enzo's dog who reminds me a little bit of Rush from Mega Man. Hexadecimal's theme music is also fantastic and reminds me of something from the Persona games. This is a good time to shout out Bob Buckley, who is Reboot's composer and does a great job all around. Side note, I love pronouncing the name of Canadians because I rarely have to worry if I'm getting the pronunciation wrong. Score 1 for Reboot in that category too.
Well, Dot, then why don't you put this on your schedule? I'll kiss a no!
This episode is about Bob and Dot having conflicts due to Dot being schedule-based and Bob being easygoing. Enzo tries to make them reunite. With every episode prior to this being an improvement over the one that came before it, I figured we were bound to hit a bump in the road sooner or later, and unfortunately, this episode is that bump. It's not a bad episode by any means, but it is kind of average and the weakest so far. There are some definite highlights, most notably the introduction of Mike the TV. This was my favorite character as a kid, and all these years later, I still enjoy his presence. The humor in Reboot often involves characters breaking the fourth wall and talking to the audience, and there's no character this works better for than Mike, who is very expressive and loves showboating. The humor in general in this episode really works. I especially love when Bob and Dot use words like dipswitch, basic, low density, and random while insulting each other. Half the time I'm not even sure what the word is supposed to be a substitute for. Like, geek in this universe apparently means a stupid person, which I don't really follow. However, the reason I don't particularly care for this episode is I find the main plotline to be pretty cliché and, well, basic. I really hate the trope of two characters getting mad at each other for minor reasons, and then learning to put their differences aside by the end. Even back in the 90s, this was a done-to-death concept, and it's only gotten worse since then. I'd like to say that Reboot added a unique spin on this story, but it really didn't. I do kind of like the role reversal at the end, where Dot acts more impulsively and Bob thinks of a plan, but even that is not that substantial or unique. This is also the first episode without a main villain like Megabyte or Hexadecimal, which would be okay, but not when the conflict that we're left with is so forced and contrived. With all that said, I do really like a lot about this episode, including the game sequence and the design of the user, which is one of the more creepy character models in the series. There are also some good moments with Enzo, so it's not like there's no merit to be found here. On the weaker side of Reboot episodes, but not a bad half hour of television in and of itself.
Don't touch that!
Trevor. I would like to thank the fine folks at okfinebethatway for letting me, Trevor from Media Mementos, tackle episode 6 in the belly of the beast. Compared to the last few episodes, this one really stands out. First of all, there's no game to speak of, and second, the main character in the story changes halfway through. In the first half of the story, it's Bob, and then in the second half, it's Enzo. Alright, sure, that's an interesting choice. And in retrospect, I think that choice was made considering where this was in the show. This was episode 6, so now's around the time where a show would normally flesh out its characters a little more and have a bit more development for future stories. This one seems to be taking that route, but it does so in a very mixed way. The story is that Frisket swallows an unformat command that Megabyte wants because he's, in pursuit of being more evil. So he abducts Frisket and Enzo, extracts the unformat command, and then loses it, and then the episode's over. Yeah, as good as this episode is when it comes to developing the cast, nothing really happens over the course of the story. The whole thing is, Frisket swallows the command, he gets captured, he and Enzo escape, and that's it. I'd understand if this was set up for a future episode where the unformat command would factor into some sort of overarching story or evil plan, but it doesn't. As far as I'm aware, it never comes up again. For me, it feels like there's a lot of filler in this episode with a ton of action scenes and banter, and none of it really amounts to much. And there's also a lot of hack and slash in this episode, and I don't know what Ian said about them so far, but as for me, I'm not really a big fan of those two. Overall, I'd say that this episode gets, I'd say a 6 out of 10. It's not bad, and I do appreciate that they're taking some time to develop the characters and introduce them more to the audience, but at the same time, there's so much fluff. One more rewrite would have made this thing great, but as it stands, it's alright. I wouldn't say it's worthy of skipping, but at the same time, it's not really worth seeking out. Thanks for having me, guys. Now back to you.
Nice try, you rapscallion, but my crew doesn't scare that easily.
A group of software pirates, which is another 10 out of 10 pun I must say, pillage mainframe and capture Bob with the intent to sell him off. This leads to Dot and Fong embarking on a swashbuckling journey to rescue Bob from captivity.
Sorry for the interruption, but I would like to make a little correction here. It was not Fong that accompanied Dot on the swashbuckling adventure. It was Enzo. Fong's contribution was locating the fastest ship in mainframe, which he did from the principal's office. Back to Ian. Thanks.
Not a complicated plot, but a fun one. Even though you could see it as an allegory for human trafficking, which is something. Anyway, I talked about how the plot of the Tiff plays on cliches I wasn't fond of, but I love swashbuckling pirate tropes, so this episode is really up my alley. This also marks the introduction of another one of my favorite characters on the show, that being the titular Crimson Binome, whose name is a parody of the film The Crimson Pirate. While Megabyte is motivated by power, and Hexadecimal is motivated by chaos, the Crimson Binome is motivated by money, giving even more variety to the villains in the series. He's voiced by the late Long John Baldry, who, outside of Reboot, is known for his musical career, but is probably best known on the internet as the voice of Robotnik on The Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog. It's always really funny to watch his scenes with that in mind.
Snooping as usual, I see.
We're also introduced to the rest of the Saucy Mare crew, including Princess Bula and Miss Sally, many of whom get the time to shine as well. Oddly enough, there's also a reference to the character Mouse, who doesn't appear in this episode, or the series so far, but would later become a very major character. I guess that's foreshadowing, and we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. It seems like the locations in this show are named after Vancouver locations such as Kitts Beach and Broadway Street, so maybe there's a sprite equivalent of Game Dude ranting on the beach about his ex-girlfriend. This is also technically the first episode to take place outside of mainframe, unless you count the games, which is going to come into play a lot more in later seasons, let me assure you. Season 1 for the most part has been gradually getting better, and this episode is no exception. With many great character interactions among the cast, more entertaining world building, and a climactic battle that is fun and funny, this is easily my favorite installment so far. Plus the music cues for the Saucy Mare are brilliant, so I'm gonna go ahead and shout out Bob Buckley once again. Hell, everybody on this show needs more attention for their work, so why not?
Enzo!
Enzo thinks he's stupid, or basic, and goes to Fawn to become smarter. Upon doing so, Enzo turns Mainframe 8-bit as he makes everyone else dumber instead of making them smarter. He basically turned Mainframe into 8-bit idiocracy, which is a really fun idea. The 4K upscale of this episode really highlights the difference in animation between Enzo and the 8-bit Mainframe, so I highly recommend watching that if you plan to check this out. As you might be able to guess, this is an episode that focuses a lot on humor, and there are a lot of laugh-out-loud moments. Bob tackling Enzo is a hilarious role reversal, and the slow motion scenes during the games near the end are really funny too. I also love how making everyone else dumber has no effect on Mike the TV. I personally considered him more random than dumb, but I guess random does mean dumb in this universe, so there you go, I guess. It's so interesting seeing Enzo struggling with trying to be smart and brave this early on, given his later development. Also, now that I think about it, I don't think we ever do get to see Enzo going to school, even though it's stated numerous times throughout the series that he does. Considering in this episode he's supposed to touch a screen to gain information, it really makes me wonder how the education system in Mainframe works, but I digress. This isn't one of my favorite episodes so far, but it is still a very solid one. There are some great moments with Fong and Enzo, and some really funny scenes and dialogue. It's also the first episode to feature 2 games, which along with the 8-bit art style, makes this a very dynamic episode visually. The first season of Reboot is great at taking somewhat base television show plots and putting a new twist on them to develop the world and characters. This episode, once again, is no exception to that rule.
Absolutely free for only $99.99.
Finally, we get a Mike the TV focused episode. This was one of my favorites as a kid for that reason. Mike gets stuck in a game with Bob, Dot, and Enzo, and must work with them to win. What follows is basically a series of vignettes, with the main characters experiencing different trials in the game. It's that simple, but boy is it a lot of fun. Mike is one of those irritating comic relief characters who really works, because everyone around him is so annoyed by him. I also find the character really funny personally, but even if you don't, the rest of the characters represent your woes. Michael Donovan, the guy who plays Mike, has great vocal range and can change his voice dramatically on a whim, which is really impressive, and a great way to continually throw the audience off. He even does a great Peter Lorre impression, which at this point I think is a requirement for every animated show ever. This entire episode, aside from the beginning and ending, takes place within the game, which is a really nice change of pace. The game itself is an RPG where everyone has a different class, therefore they must work together to achieve a mutual goal. Even though they already did a medieval setting for a game, this one still manages to feel different. It's another very humor-driven episode, which makes sense given Mike plays a huge role. Even so, there are some genuinely sweet moments too, such as when the team learns to appreciate Mike, despite still being occasionally annoyed by him. I also find Bob's doppelganger near the end to actually be pretty damn frightening. The other doppelgangers, not so much, but credit where it's due. If you find Mike annoying in a bad way, you might not like this episode so much, but for everyone else, this is a really fun installment. Mike seems to be a comment on irksome side characters in video games like the talking companions in Zelda, even though he technically predates Navi, who started that trend. It's retroactively perfect and makes for, in my opinion, one of the best humor-focused episodes of the show yet. I especially love the jabs at commercials and product placement in television shows, perpetuated by soulless corporations looking to make a buck. Good reminder to never stoop to that level. On an unrelated note, this YouTube video is brought to you by Raid Shadow.
Nice rig you got here, big guy. Custom job.
Megabyte hires Mouse, the character previously alluded to in the Crimson Binome episode, to hack into Bob's brain and reveal information about the supercomputer. After shrinking down in size and entering a drink from Al's Wait and Eat, Mouse, along with Hack and Slash, accidentally enter Enzo's body instead. Another classic concept, but done well. This is the only appearance of Mouse in Season 1, but thankfully, we do get a really good impression of what she's like. She's not like most other characters who at this point seem to land firmly on the side of either good or evil. She's a very grey character, kind of like the Crimson Binome, except more of a femme fatale archetype. Between Mouse, Dot, Hexadecimal, and a few other characters we will get to later, Reboot sure had a better grasp on writing strong female characters than many other cartoons at the time. Mouse is also a very competent hacker, which makes for a hilarious contrast when paired up with the dim-witted Hack and Slash. We also get a few moments with Megabyte's other minions here, such as Smiley, who I really like. This is also an episode where the animation gets to shine in a lot of areas. I love the sweeping shots of Mainframe both in the opening and when they're flying around in the hot rod car thing. The animation on Enzo when they're picking at his brain, both in terms of his face and body movements, is absolutely hilarious. Kind of looks like the type of visuals you'd see in a school project for 3D animation. Despite having a lot of humor, this is definitely an episode where the jokes are balanced out with the action and world building. It's really interesting to see the inside of what the sprites look like, and the action sequence near the end is a lot of fun. It really demonstrates a lot of artistry in the movement and speed, along with the mix of humor and tension that Reboot does so well. We also see Al for the first time, sort of, as he's tied up by ropes by Hack and Slash. Okay, not exactly a face reveal, but at least we know how big he is and what his shoes look like. That's more than enough for me.
I've always wanted to do that.
Dot prepares a surprise talent show for Enzo's birthday, while Bob distracts Enzo, and Megabyte becomes bitter over having not been invited. What follows is basically a series of tryouts for the talent show, interspliced with the occasional scene of Bob, Enzo, or Megabyte. I've talked about how certain episodes are more humor-focused than others, but this is the only episode of Season 1 I describe as a straight-up comedy show. Thankfully, it pulls it off very well, making for my personal favorite episode of Season 1. Reboot has always been big on referential humor ever since the first episode, but Talent Night dials it up to 11. Literally, as that's referenced in the episode as well. Beyond the nod to Spinal Tap, this episode also features references to everything under the sun, including Doom,
Glitch, BFG.
Star Trek,
It's gonna be a long, long time.
Forbidden Planet,
Certainly, sir. Will 64 gallons be sufficient?
The Village People, Michael Jackson,
Oh no, not breakdancing!
Nat King Cole,
Unforgettable.
Elvis Presley,
Ladies and gentlemen, Megabyte has left the building!
and much more that I probably didn't even pick up on. Hell, the freaking YTV logo robot makes an appearance at one point, so they left no stone unturned. The funniest reference in my opinion is when the characters from the Money or Nothing music video pop up and have sandbags dropped on them. This is referencing how the creators of Reboot were known for nothing else other than animating that music video for a long time, so this was a very funny, albeit passive-aggressive way, to vent their frustrations. However, the episode does contain more than just reference humor, as the character interaction is great as well. All the talent show tryouts are broken up with Mike the TV's narration, who thankfully gets a lot of time to shine here. While a lot of the humor is really in your face, a few of the jokes are a little bit less surface level. There is one point where a stand-up comedian tells a joke in binary code, which the crowd laughs at wholeheartedly. I wanted to see if the binary code actually was gibberish or translated to anything, and sure enough, it directly translates into the classic Henry Youngman line, "Take my wife, please." The humor in the show is so nerdy that I can't help but love it. I also appreciate how it respects nerd culture and does reference humor right, as opposed to something like the Big Bazinga theory. The subplot with Megabyte becoming angry over not being invited to the birthday party almost feels out of character for him, but not enough to where it's off-putting. For someone who is usually full of hatred and is constructing dangerous schemes to destroy Mainframe, it's really funny seeing Megabyte being so petty here, but it's a great aspect of his character. It reminds me of Bowser in Mario Party or something like that. The scene where Megabyte shreds on his guitar at the end is the perfect ridiculous but simultaneously awesome way to wrap up this episode. Dot singing seductively to Enzo is kind of creepy though, I'll admit. As are the Null balloon animals when you consider that Nulls are essentially dead sprites, but that's not enough to ruin the episode, thankfully. Talent Night is absolutely hysterical from start to finish, and contains so many fun scenes that I can't help but love it. I don't think this episode represents the tone of the show as a whole very well, and those who are looking for more action and world building may not be as huge on it as I am. Regardless, Talent Night is an absolute classic, and probably one of my favorite half hours of television from the 90s.
What you are experiencing is a temporary distortion of reality.
This episode reveals that Megabyte has control over many mainframe residents by removing their PID codes. Dot plans to make an energy park to help out the sprites in this situation. While this is going on, Dot also starts seeing temporary distortions of reality which foreshadow future events.
Future events such as these will affect you in the future.
This is the first episode of a two-part season finale, thus making it the first episode of Reboot to experiment with serialization. As such, the stakes here are much higher than a lot of other episodes, and we're much more focused on action and drama rather than comedy. Most of the comedy comes from the opening scenes, especially the game at the beginning, which shows the user being uncharacteristically incompetent due to playing an older game. It doesn't take long for the tone to change though, as soon as Bob and Enzo regroup at Dot's diner. Dot's emotional journey here is much more engaging than a lot of the previous episodes, and Megabyte's plan is much more sinister. We also get much clearer motivations behind both characters' actions throughout the series, and why they do what they do. I really enjoy how this episode explains how and why people follow Megabyte, despite the fact that he's a virus hellbent on enslaving everyone. It's also revealed here that Dot is a freedom fighter, which explains why she has connections all over mainframe, beyond her good business skills. I really enjoy the twist ending where Megabyte gets everyone to turn on Dot due to making them believe that they were working together after hack and slash hold everyone hostage. This is a great way to demonstrate how ruthless and manipulative Megabyte is, by not only winning against Dot, but villainizing her against the people she truly cares about more than anyone. At least that's what he thinks. Cyrus's betrayal was a good twist too that I didn't see coming. The episode concludes with Bob and Dot entering another game, although Dot is too devastated by what just happened to truly care. It's a very dark cliffhanger to end with, and a perfect setup for the next episode. I always appreciate shows which are able to take their audiences seriously when it comes to character drama, especially if they're supposedly aimed at kids. This episode really does feel like a big step forward in a lot of ways. The stakes are higher, the character development and motivations are much more fleshed out, the drama is more impactful, and the action is more chaotic. Although slight nitpick, some of the crowd shots do feel a little bit static, which was also true in Talent Night. This is one of the few ways in which the animation feels dated in a bad way, but it's not enough to ruin the experience. Regardless, this was a great episode and an engaging first part to get you pumped up for the upcoming season finale.
Look out!
Picking up where the last episode left off, Bob and Dot are now in a freaky circus game that they need to complete while Dot deals with her guilt about failing the mainframe residents. When Dot can't motivate herself, Fong does an It's a Wonderful Lifestyle mental trick where he shows Dot what would happen if she gives up and loses the game. Here she finds out that Megabyte will take over and turn the city into a bleak utopia known as Megaframe. The first thing that stands out to me in this episode are the visuals, which are the best that the show has to offer up until this point. I really enjoy creepy carnivals, so the game in this episode is really appealing to my personal preferences, even though I'm not exactly a juggalo.
Fucking magnets, how do they work?
Beyond that, the game has a really appealing color palette, and the crazy camera angles do a great job at highlighting the warped nature of the funhouse. Dot's Sad Cloud costume in contrast to Bob's Happy costume is a nice touch too. Megaframe is also visually stimulating, and kind of reminiscent of Biff's Utopia from Back to the Future 2. Beyond the visuals, this episode further expands on Dot and Megabyte's development from the previous episode. Here we get to finally see what the full extent of Megabyte's plans would be had he taken over Mainframe, which makes us care even more about the city's well-being. Not only that, these have easily been the best Dot episodes we've had so far, as they really highlight her commitment to the city and its residents. I also liked Fong in this episode more than the previous ones. He's really smart and gives Dot really great guidance that's important for her development. I love seeing the characters getting challenged not only by an external threat, but by their own internal doubt. This type of storytelling is when Reboot is at its best in my opinion. Even though this is a follow-up to last episode's story, the tone and plots are completely different. This feels more dynamic than a simple follow-up, which I really appreciate. It's another somewhat classic story that references It's a Wonderful Life, but done really well, with its own spin on the material, as Reboot's best episodes tend to be. That glimpse into the future takes up half the episode, but that's okay because it's really entertaining and important to Dot's development. What a great way to wrap up the season. Also, the PID building near the end looks familiar, but I can't exactly put my finger on why.
Hey look, it's Science World!
Season 1 of Reboot holds up really well. This is a very nostalgic show for me, I'll admit, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't hold up on its own merits even today. The characters are great, the comedy is really funny, the music is well done, the world building is fascinating, and the animation, despite being technologically primitive, I still think has a lot of charm and artistic merit to it. It doesn't go as far and deep as subsequent seasons, partially due to the episodic format, and partially due to having to establish the world and characters. I definitely think that this is a show that does improve from becoming darker and more serialized, much like how Moral Laurel did. However, that doesn't stop Season 1 from being a lot of fun, and occasionally containing some great emotional moments. This show is also really good at establishing the stakes, as the characters feel very challenged by the threat in each episode. There was only one episode this season I thought was kind of average, but even that one had a lot of elements I could appreciate in it. Every other episode was either good or great, more often than not the latter. The second half of the season was an overall improvement over the first half, so the show has already started to evolve this early on. Got nowhere to go but up as we enter Season 2.
Magnificent.
Season 2 kicks off with Mainframe getting a new upgrade, presumably from the user. It turns out the upgrade was actually Megabyte, who disguised himself in order to get into the principal office and perform a shutdown command that would wipe the entire system. Fong cryptically tells Bob to use Megabyte's greed in order to take him down. For the most part, this is a back-to-basics episode. Megabyte hatches a plan, and Bob has to stop him. Basic is an insult for the characters in this show, but for me, it doesn't necessarily mean bad, as long as you keep other episodes fresh with new ideas. We also get a lot of great character moments here, especially from Fong, Bob, and Megabyte, who have a great dynamic together. Enzo, Dot, and Cecil get some really great scenes too. Here we see how upgrades descend from the sky and are given to the mainframe residents. Even as a kid, I always saw the user as a very clear allegory for God, considering he or she created the world the show takes place in and affects it in mysterious ways, including deleting or nullifying whoever he sees fit. The very opening credits of Reboot even reference a search for God, with Bob claiming he intends to find out if what they believe about the user is true or not.
No one knows for sure, but I intend to find out. Reboot!
The Guardian Code totally destroyed the sense of mystery, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I'd probably need an entire separate video to explain my thoughts on the God allegories in depth, but in terms of how upgrades work, I view them as the user's blessings to mainframe. Man, between Reboot and VeggieTales, early CGI shows certainly had their fair share of religious influences. Speaking of upgrades, Season 2 does indeed show a lot of improvements in the visual department. This is in terms of the animation itself, as well as the use of camera movement. There are far more sweeping shots that really show off Mainframe in its glory, which is only going to continue as the season progresses. I'm a big nerd when it comes to seeing sets and animation, so I think this is a really great way to make the world feel more interconnected and real. You could also maybe argue that the upgraded animation has an in-universe explanation, with the user perhaps getting a better graphics card or something like that. Oddly enough, my only real gripe with this episode is a scene that features my favorite character, Hexadecimal. Here she confirms a deal with Megabyte that states she will have 50% control over Megaframe. This is kind of pointless here, as Megabyte's plan in this episode never really gets far enough to where it would matter. The real purpose of this scene is to drop the fact that Megabyte and Hexadecimal are not only working together, but are relatives of each other. I think this would be much more satisfying to have this revealed later in the season, during an episode where it would actually matter. I do like the twist a lot, but this scene feels really shoehorned into this episode, and it kind of disappoints me knowing it could have been placed in a more appropriate time during the season. Even so, that's not enough to ruin the episode as a whole. The action, character interactions, and loving homages to movies like Aliens, The Terminator, and Predator sure make this an entertaining installment. This is a good way to kick off the second season and get back into the groove of things, even if it doesn't rank among the best episodes of Season 1. A Codemaster named Lens the Reaper enters Mainframe looking to erase the legendary Codemaster Talon, who was apparently last seen in the city. That would be all well and good, except Lens is highly destructive and will rip Mainframe apart until he gets what he desires. He even blows up a building and knocks it over, which is a huge indication that this is a pre-9/11 children's show. Lens the Reaper is a pretty cool one-off villain, and it's nice to see a threat to mainframe that isn't Megabyte or Hexadecimal. Megabyte does make a cameo, but that's about as pointless as Hexadecimal's cameo from the last episode. Lens the Reaper's design is cool, presence is threatening, and voice acting is well done, making for a very welcome addition to the cast. This episode also expands on the backstory of the side character we haven't seen much of, that being Old Man Pearson. Spoiler! Old Man Pearson is actually Talon, who gave up his life as a codemaster and retired in mainframe. Nevertheless, Lens the Reaper says, "Once a codemaster, always a codemaster," resulting in a climactic standoff that pays homage to the good, the bad, and the ugly. This episode all around has a lot of references to westerns, which should come as no surprise considering the very title, High Code, is a parody of High Noon. Even a lot of the episode's themes are akin to what you'd find in westerns, such as a stranger rolling into town, and a resident having to deal with his dark past that he's trying to escape from. We also get the first actual game of Season 2 here, which, wouldn't you know it, is western themed. Like many great sci-fi stories, Reboot is derivative of great art, but it manages to feel fresh by adding its own unique style and flavor to these classic themes. I definitely think this episode is a major improvement over the first episode of Season 2. It gives us a new villain that we didn't know we needed, and develops a side character that we didn't know needed developing. I really love the end of the episode where the character's dedication to self-sacrifice in order to protect the lives of everyone is what causes Lens the Reaper to spare them. It really demonstrates why these characters do what they do, and gets not only Lens, but us as an audience, to appreciate them a whole lot more. Gotta love how a show marketed towards children can make comments on life and death by turning the characters into computer programs which can be deleted or nullified. Not the type of thing I'd expect from children's programming nowadays, which is another reason that Reboot is so special.
Well, just stay out of my way while I... Run for it!
Megabyte drains energy from a GameCube in order to use it to break into the mainframe archives and create a gateway to the supercomputer. However, Hack and Slash end up draining too much energy, causing two GameCubes to collide with each other, hence the episode's title. Much like the first episode of the season, this one starts out as a pretty typical Megabyte plot. Certainly serviceable, but nothing ultimately that special. However, as this episode continues, things start to get a lot crazier and more creative. We finally get to see what Mainframe's energy core looks like.
What is this place? This is the mainframe archives, the storage space for old information.
Which is essentially a room filled with computer desktop icons. Also, we have seen games become corrupted in previous episodes, but not to this extent. The very concept of combining a war game with a dinosaur game in this world leads to some pretty hilarious results. I mean, this episode has a frickin' dinosaur tank. This would be the coolest thing ever if it didn't get defeated by pressing a button on its chest. But still, how could I get that upset? If you want a 2-word review of this episode, dinosaur tank. There you go. But beyond that, this episode has a lot of other qualities to it as well. Even though the plot is your typical Megabyte affair, the journey that he goes on throughout the episode is quite fresh. Upon getting trapped in the game with Bob, the two reluctantly have to work together in order to defeat the user. Bob even saves Megabyte at one point, claiming that it's part of his programming to guard anyone, even viruses. This causes Megabyte to spare the lives of Bob, Dot, and Enzo once they destroy the gateway computer at the end. It's so fascinating to see a much more sympathetic and reasonable side of Megabyte than we're used to in the same episode where he's causing so much mayhem in Mainframe. We also get quite a bit of Hack and Slash, who always make for great comedic relief. I have a feeling Megabyte's plans would actually pan out once in a while if it wasn't for Hack and Slash's incompetence. Overall, I'd say this episode was better than Infected, but not quite as good as High Code. The character who really shines here and makes the episode is Megabyte for his story arc and the chemistry he has with Bob. That doesn't mean the other characters don't have great moments too. I especially like when Bob is telling Enzo that there are other mainframes, which plays on the theory of multiple universes. And no, I'm not calling it the multiverse theory, because I'm sick of that term nowadays. Beyond that, the concept of games colliding is a lot of fun, and this episode really manages to stick the landing, as well as expanding on the characters and mythology of Reboot as a whole. Also, dinosaur tank. Enough said.
Who's that narrator?
It's Jason.
What's up YouTube? What's up everyone? This is Jason Entertainment. I'm very honored and excited to be here. I will be reviewing the 4th episode of Season 2 titled Bad Bob. In this episode, Megabyte attacks the principal's office to steal Mainframe's core energy. Bob and Enzo are trapped in a game where they have to race against Megabyte and restore Mainframe's core energy, but also being careful about the user in the game. So for me guys, this episode is very solid. I was thoroughly entertained during the whole episode, and specifically my best part is of course the race part. It's so cool, but it's also like filled with some very interesting Easter eggs that I was able to catch. So I'm going to tell you some of the Easter eggs I found out interesting, and probably I missed some, but I did my best. Alright guys, sorry I don't know every reference, but I think I did my good research and I have some very interesting things to tell you. So first off, let's talk about the race itself. The race itself is a clear imagery of the movie Mad Max from Mel Gibson. From the driver's looks, from the vehicles, the guns, the landscape, like everything gives you so much Mad Max vibes and was heavily inspired by that movie. Also, like if you watch this frame, you can see that the user's car is identical to the Batmobile from the late 80s to early 90s. Like this is a huge reference to Batman with Michael Keaton's era. So yeah, it's very iconic and it's very hard to not see it.
What have you got for me, number one?
It's a volatile situation. Anything can happen when a game is corrupted. To make matters worse, I've calculated 29 million cycles before the stolen energy dissipates, and Mainframe will be offline.
For this Easter egg, this actually took me a while, because I'm really not familiar with this franchise, but I noticed that a character called Number 1 in this episode appeared to be wearing a familiar uniform. It turns out that he is wearing a Star Trek uniform. So I asked one of my good friends that he is a huge fan of Star Trek, and he told me that this character seems to be designed like Commander Riker from Star Trek The Next Generation, because he has similar facial features than him. So as you can see in this image, he really looks like him, like you see like the beard and everything. So yeah. Finally, I noticed another Easter egg. It's in the race itself. Megabyte takes the form of a truck with his face covering the whole front. This really reminded me of a horror movie I used to watch with my parents called Maximum Overdrive, where actually an evil truck with a goblin face brings terror to the town. Like, the similarity really is incredible here. Also, like this truck in Maximum Overdrive could run by himself, as well as in the race Megabyte could run by himself. He didn't need a pilot. So yeah, I think the reference is pretty clear here. So guys, those were my the Easter eggs that I was able to catch during this episode. Next up, the 5th episode of Season 2 will be a shifting point, because without giving any spoilers yet, let's say the narrative will have some changes, alright? Anyway guys, so this was Jason Entertainment. Thank you so much for having me here, and I can't wait to hear the rest of the review. Take care guys.
What are you smiling about?
I like it.
Why, thank you.
Alright, we finally get to another hexadecimal-centered episode. It's about damn time. Hexadecimal breaks into Mainframe's archives and gains access to the system's paint command. From here, Hexadecimal aspires to be a widely recognized artist, which she accomplishes by covering Mainframe in insane paintings that severely tamper with the city's functionality. Bob sets out to stop her before the damage becomes permanent. From the very moment this episode opened, I knew it was going to be something special. The camera sweeping over lost angles, with Hexadecimal's music playing in the background, was not only really cool visually, but a great way to build up to Hex's reveal that was really satisfying. From there, the episode wastes no time as the stakes ramp up immediately, with Hex going absolutely ballistic with the paint tool. She dresses Megabyte up like a clown and traps the Binome guards in paintings, Super Mario 64 style. Let me say right now that if you've watched Reboot but haven't seen the episodes in 4K, This is, so far, the one I recommend viewing the most in that format. This is by far the most stimulating episode to look at yet, with so many crazy visuals to enjoy in the foreground, background, or any other ground you can think of. Imagine the PS1 game LSD Dream Emulator if the crazy visuals there were actually related to a story. On top of that, if you're a big classic art nerd, which I am to a very limited extent, you'll appreciate the nods to painting and sculptures littered throughout the show. This includes the Scream, the Persistence of Memory, the Thinker, the Creation of Adam, and the Mona Lisa, just to name a few. Hex even goes through a blue period at one point, just like Pablo Picasso, so you can definitely tell that the writers of this episode had a lot of fun expressing their love for art everywhere. As great as the visuals and references are, they certainly don't overshadow the very strong character interaction found here. This episode summarizes to me exactly what hexadecimal is all about, causing chaos, which is entertaining and beautiful, but destructive at the same time. After such a long time without a Hex-focused episode, it's great to see her back and crazier than ever. We finally even get to see what's behind her mask in one of the most unsettling scenes yet. Hex isn't the only character to return here, as we once again get a story involving Mike the TV, who has become a documentarian. Mike and Hexadecimal are the most unlikely pairing I could come up with, but I'll be damned if they aren't absolutely amazing together. I guess they're polar opposites in terms of morals, but they do have the same theatrical nature to them, which is always a lot of fun. Really, everybody gets a moment to shine here. Bob, Dot, Enzo, Fong, Frisket, Megabyte, Hack and Slash. Even Hexadecimal's pet Scuzzy has one of the best scenes we've seen yet. It goes to show the power of writing really great characters and having them work off of each other. Honestly, this might top Talent Night as my favorite episode so far. It's a very close call. The humor, world building, character variety, trippy visuals, and pacing are all on point here. There's not a single moment that drags one bit. I didn't even talk about the climax with Enzo separating himself into different windows, which was one of the strangest but coolest things I've ever seen. Also, the final shot here is one of the scariest things I've ever seen in a children's show, and a big part of the reason Hex gave me nightmares as a kid. Even as I'm sitting here writing this conclusion, I'm thinking of way more things I want to talk about since I love this episode so much. I'll summarize it by saying that this is hands down one of the best, if not the best, episodes up until this point.
We can never stay together, no matter what happens.
We can be together, Enzo.
No! What are you doing?
Enzo is feeling depressed due to not having any sprites his own age to play with, as well as not being allowed to go into games anymore. Both of these problems are solved when a GameCube lands on Enzo, and he meets a game sprite within it. This episode is a pretty seminal one in the series for a few reasons. The first half of Season 2 returned to the episodic format of Season 1, but as we enter the second half, we're finally moving into the more serialized format. Dot refusing to let Enzo enter games is something that was first established passively in the episode Bad Bob. There are also a bunch of references to previous episodes, such as dramatic recreations of certain events on Mike the TV, Bob using old episode clips in his game survival seminar, and Frisket going off gallivanting with the Crimson Binome. It's not that important to the plot here, but it is still light serialization that will get much heavier by the end of the season. This is also the episode that introduces a new member to the main cast, that being AndrAIa, the game sprite voiced by AndrAIa Libman. Yes, a woman named AndrAIa is playing AndrAIa. Quite the stretch, huh? For those of you who don't know, AndrAIa Libman is the voice of Pinkie Pie and Fluttershy on My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, so all you bronies out there can rejoice. She does a really great job here, which is doubly impressive considering she was still a preteen when she was playing the role. AndrAIa is a welcome addition to the cast, as through her, we finally get to see the perspective of someone who isn't from mainframe or from the net. Also, her friendship with Enzo is super adorable. The only issue is that AndrAIa is a game sprite and therefore must stay within the game when it ends. But thankfully, she finds a way around this. Dang, Reboot really made me think of random NPCs in video games way more than I did prior. We're also given some backstory here that we weren't privy to before. On top of learning about the many differences between mainframe sprites and game sprites, we also start to learn a little bit more about Dot and Enzo's father.
And he hasn't got any friends because there aren't many small sprites left in mainframe since the Twin City was destroyed.
It's just that talk of the other city reminds me of my father.
The experiment just got out of control.
He apparently worked in a Twin City to mainframe, which was accidentally destroyed due to an experiment that he was working on, killing both himself and most sprites Enzo's age. Believe it or not, this is going to come up again in future episodes, so keep it in mind for now. Overall, this is a great episode. Not quite as good as the previous two, but it does do a great job establishing a new character, dramatically building on the world's backstory, and introducing a serialized format in a subtle but satisfying way. The game in the episode is pretty cool too, even if it does lose some tension by giving the user multiple lives. Still, it was a good way for AndrAIa and Enzo to get to know each other and show off some pretty cool underwater visuals. Easily one of the most important episodes in Reboot's history, and a very good kickoff for what's yet to come.
Although this is a fascinating story, I feel I must draw your attention to a more pressing matter. Really, what's that, Mike?
Mike the TV accidentally shatters Hexadecimal's looking glass mirror, which releases a black creature that infects Hex. If you don't understand why Mike is hanging out at Hexadecimal's lair, watch the end of Painted Windows. All the Nulls in Mainframe swarm Hexadecimal to protect her, creating a giant creature named Nullzilla that terrorizes the city. While this is happening, Hack and Slash try to locate Megabyte's pet Null Nibbles, which has attached itself to Nullzilla. This episode expands a lot more on the lore of the Nulls. While they seemed mostly like brainless slug creatures previously, they clearly have an instinctual loyalty to Hexadecimal, considering the way they try to protect her in Mainframe. While we've seen Megabyte's pet Null once or twice before this is the first episode where Nibbles plays a significant role. Megabyte also refers to Nibbles as his father at one point, which really opens up another can of worms for the future. The subplot with Hack and Slash is easily my favorite part of the episode, as it really gives the two of them a lot of time to work off of each other and be funny. On top of that, Fong explains he's working on an experiment to recompile the Nulls back into sprites, which is a theory that hasn't been tested yet. I've always found the Nulls kind of creepy, and putting them at the forefront of this episode intensifies that feeling in an organic way. Beyond that, this episode is basically one big homage to Japanese kaiju monster movies and series. Fong creates a giant robot to battle Nullzilla, which is controlled by Bob, Dot, Enzo, AndrAIa, Frisket, and Mike. This kind of makes me wonder if this is the one episode that the creators of the Guardian Code watched, since they basically gave that show the visual style of Power Rangers. Regardless, the fight between the robot and Nullzilla is very entertaining, and feels like a very loving tribute to kaiju films. That, or they were bitter towards Power Rangers for getting better ratings. I'd be pissed too if I made something as good as Reboot, so I can't even really blame them. This isn't one of my favorite episodes in the season so far, but it is still a very solid outing. The action is entertaining, the exploration of the lore is interesting, and the humor is consistently funny. A lot of characters get a lot of screen time here, and they have really good moments, especially Hack and Slash, who surprisingly steal the show. This is also the first episode, aside from the Season 1 two-parter and maybe Painted Windows, that ends on a cliffhanger, with Megabyte getting possessed by the same creature that infected Hexadecimal. The continuity is becoming even tighter, so let's delve right into the next episode to see the results of this.
I am become Gigabyte, destroyer of systems.
Now this isn't love.
Picking up right where the last episode left off, the residents of Mainframe clean up Nullzilla's mess, while a now infected Megabyte merges with a weakened Hexadecimal. This creates a super virus called Gigabyte, which Bob must separate back into Megabyte and Hexadecimal before it harbors enough energy to create a portal to the net. While this is going on, Fong powers down the entire city to conserve energy, and Bob enlists in the help of an old friend, which is revealed to be Mouse. You might have thought that since the characters faced such a big threat in the last episode, this outing would be a little bit more mellow. Instead, Gigabyte proves to be an even bigger threat than Nullzilla due to harboring the powers of Megabyte and Hexadecimal. You can definitely feel the stakes escalating in the second half of Season 2, with each opponent becoming more challenging than the one that came before it. It kind of feels like video game progression, which, is fitting considering the nature of the show. I personally think the design of Gigabyte looks a little bit silly, as he kind of looks like a Mexican wrestler, but the overall threat of this creature is more than enough to make up for that. This is also the episode where Hexadecimal reveals definitively to Bob that Megabyte is her brother. This great reveal might have been even better if it wasn't partially spoiled in the first episode of the season. Seriously, screw that scene from before. While I'm on the topic, I also thought that Mouse's return would be a little bit more impactful if they didn't show her in the opening credits this season, but maybe I'm just nitpicking at this point. Whatever the case, both reveals here have dramatic impact on the episode's story and really work in context with the episode. Mouse is great amongst the regular cast, and fortunately, she gets paired with Dot in this episode. I say fortunately because Dot and Mouse have great chemistry together, even though it's a predictable arc where they dislike each other but learn to get along by the end. Dot does have legitimate reasons to distrust Mouse since she is mysterious and condescending, so their dynamic feels much more organic here than that time where Dot and Bob were fighting with each other. Every character has a different reaction to Mouse, with some fully believing in her morals, and others having suspicions. By the end of the episode, we as the audience don't even know if we can trust her or not, which I think is good storytelling. I'd say that I like this episode more than the previous one due to the higher stakes and even better character interaction. I also enjoy how Mainframe looks when it's powered down, since not only does it give off a pretty cool sunset look, but it is symbolic of the show itself getting darker. There are still a lot of comedic elements here though, especially from Hack and Slash as usual. I love how Bob gets a taste of what Megabyte has been going through when Hack and Slash make the situation worse by trying to help him. The stronger character dynamics and story elements that build over time are a big part of why I like Season 2 of Reboot overall more than Season 1. The end of the episode makes it clear that while the day is saved, they're not quite out of the woods yet. Speaking of which, time for the penultimate episode of Season 2.
CGI Special Agent Fax Mode.
CGI Special Agent Data Nelly. They couldn't help overhearing you. You're looking for a missing person?
Many residents of Mainframe, including Dot and Al's waiter, mysteriously go missing. Fong hires CGI agents Fax Modem and Data Nully to help Bob locate the culprit, who they suspect to be Mouse. While this isn't true, Mouse has a few secrets of her own that boil to the surface. This episode of Reboot takes a lot of inspiration from sci-fi horror properties, the most notable of which being The X-Files. Even though I've never watched The X-Files, I have seen it referenced a lot in shows like The Simpsons, so I do get the context thankfully. Fax Modem and Data Nully are parodies of the characters Fox Mulder and Dana Scully. Gillian Anderson, the actress who plays Dana Scully,
I'm Dana Scully,
actually voices Data Nully herself in this episode, which is really cool. These two characters are absolutely hilarious and provide the perfect comedic timing to contrast with the episode's darker elements, especially Fax Modem, who goes on many nonsensical diatribes. It's not all X-Files references though, as the climax where Mouse finds all the captured Mainframe residents in cocoons is an obvious homage to Alien. In fact, the whole creature build-up here is very similar to Alien, only showing the threat sparingly until the climax. Also, Feathers McGraw, the penguin from Wallace and Gromit, makes a cameo appearance here. He previously appeared briefly in Identity Crisis Part 2, but I forgot to bring it up. I like how he's just an established part of the universe now because why not? Reboot has so many references that I often used to call it a Tarantino movie for kids. The threat in this episode turns out to be the web creature that infected Hexadecimal and Megabyte. At the end of the last episode, Bob managed to split Gigabyte into 3 separate entities, leaving the web creature on the loose. We finally get a more tangible form of the web creature to look at, which is really cool and pretty dang scary. Given the tone of the episode, this was the perfect way for it to reveal itself. The CGI agents are definitely the highlight of the episode, but this is also a pretty important outing for Mouse too. It turns out that Mouse has been working for Turbo, the Prime Guardian who is in charge of the other Guardians. Mouse sends information regarding the web creature to Turbo, which, unbeknownst to her, is protocol for Mainframe's destruction. This is great development for Mouse, as while we know that she means well by now, her deceitful nature has landed Mainframe in jeopardy. That, along with the web creature evading capture and making a portal to the web, ends the episode on a very chilling cliffhanger. From start to finish, this is easily one of the best episodes so far. Visually it's amazing, and keeping in with the theme of Mainframe getting physically darker as the episodes get darker. I especially like the scene with Mouse traveling through a dark warehouse that is illuminated by the light of her hair. Beyond that, this episode perfectly balances the horror aspects with the comedy too, having a lot of laugh-out-loud moments with the CGI agents, Mike the TV, Al, Al's waiters, and Cecil, who I guess we find out here is actually pronounced Cecil. Even without Megabyte and Hexadecimal's presence, the stakes in Mainframe have never been higher. Both as an episode individually, and as a way to get us hyped for the season finale, this was a fantastic installment in the series. The citizens of Mainframe prepare for war as the portal to the web hangs over them. Bob strikes a deal with Megabyte and Hexadecimal for their assistance, while the two viruses hatch a plan to deceive him in the process. Given that the second season of Reboot has been progressively getting darker, and the stories have become more consequential, you'd expect the season finale to fall in line with this and give us something very substantial. Oh man, does Web World Wars ever deliver on that promise and then some. I remember watching this episode as a kid and being totally flabbergasted at what I saw. Even today, I think it holds up tremendously as by far one of the best episodes of the season, if not the series. This is an episode that is kind of hard to talk about, not because it's slow or not much happens, but because it's very focused on the action and the size and scale of the story. The first act is basically establishing where every character will be during the final confrontation, mixed with the occasional banter. The second act is basically one long action sequence, and the third act, well, I'll talk about that in a bit. The first two acts are somewhat light on story. Not that I timed it or anything, but I feel pretty confident in saying that this episode has the least amount of dialogue out of any Reboot episode so far. With that said, considering this is what the second half of Season 2 has been building up to, it feels extremely satisfying. Even the first act, where everyone is preparing for war, is really engaging, as you really feel the danger literally and figuratively looming over the city. When the action finally does happen, it's pretty amazing to look at. Whoever did the camera movement for Reboot deserved to get paid a lot, because like I've stated repeatedly, it looks absolutely incredible. It really shines here during the sky dogfights, which look really good in themselves, especially in 4K. The action during the second act keeps escalating and escalating to the point where it becomes the best action sequence so far in the series. Even with the copious amounts of build-up, the action really exceeds any expectations I had initially. Even though the first two acts have much less dialogue than we're used to, what is here is pretty great. Dot and Mouse still have great chemistry, and I like how all the characters have a hard time working with Megabyte and Hexadecimal for obvious reasons. Probably the funniest part of the episode is when Megabyte turns his armored Binome carriers, ABCs for short, on the mainframe residents, causing the Binome Binky to shout,
It's the ABCs! They've turned on us! Treacherous dogs!
This is a reference to how ABC, the network running Reboot in the US, did not renew the show for a third season on the channel. I miss when meta humor used to be this clever. But okay, let's really get into the third act, which is by far the best part. One ongoing thread in Season 2 involves Enzo lying to AndrAIa about being a guardian. You'd think this would conclude in a regular liar revealed fashion, but instead, Bob promotes Enzo to Guardian Cadet in this episode, telling him that he will be Mainframe's new Guardian if anything happens to Bob. Spoiler! Something happens to Bob. While everything is going to plan in regards to closing the portal, Megabyte and Hexadecimal trap Bob in a pod and shoot him up into the web at the last minute. So yeah, now the main character of the series is gone, Enzo is the new Guardian, and Megabyte and Hexadecimal won the battle. Just when it looks like Season 2 is about to set things back to status quo for Season 3, the story takes a total right turn and absolutely changes everything. Say what you want about Reboot's occasionally dated animation and rare missteps, this show takes some of the biggest risks I've ever seen in television, especially for something aimed at all ages. That, along with the incredible action sequences, make Web World Wars the best finale Season 2 could have ever asked for. Even with the limited dialogue, this ends up being one of the most emotionally resonant episodes of this series that completely blew my mind the first time I saw it. It's not quite my favorite episode, but only because Season 2 has been so strong as a whole. Speaking of which, let's wrap it up. Season 2 of Reboot is essentially a slow-turning wheel. The first half of it is very much in line with Season 1's tone, while the latter half of it approaches a much darker, more serialized format that would continue on to subsequent seasons. As such, Season 2 is Reboot's transitional phase, where we start off in one place and end up in a totally different set of circumstances. Now that the world and character dynamics are well established, the writers are able to do much more with the storytelling, even during the episodic format of the first half. Season 1 is nothing to write off as there were many great episodes there, but as a whole, Season 2 feels more complete, even with 3 less episodes. I loved how the consequences of many events are carried over into subsequent episodes, first little by little, until eventually leading up to an epic climax. Even so, each episode feels distinct from each other, with the tone encompassing comedy, action, horror, drama, westerns, pretty much any kind of genre you can think of. Reboot has covered it, and covered it well. And if you think the show can't keep up this high quality going into the next season, well, buckle up, buckaroos. We're about to get into what, in my opinion, is the cream of the crop regarding this show. Without further ado, let's jump into Reboot Season 3. when the second part of this video comes out. Yeah, I know, we're splitting the video up into 2 parts. But hey, since Reboot has started to become a big fan of ending things on cliffhangers, we felt it only fitting that this video end on a cliffhanger as well. Yep, that's the excuse we're going with. Thanks to everyone for watching, and I hope you'll tune in for part 2 to see our thoughts on Reboot Seasons 3 and 4.
Hi, this is Mike the Editor. Would you like to support our channel? Please do so by watching our videos, dropping us lots of comments, good, bad, whatever you prefer. If you like this video, smash the like button with your face. If you're not subscribed already, please do so, and remember the bell icon for notifications to new videos. We also have a Patreon, which the link will be down there somewhere in the description. If you want to help us out monetarily, that'd be great. Also, the video you just watched, fair use policy, blah blah blah, something something something. We also have a Discord server, which please come and join the chat. The link will be also in the description. Huge thanks to both Trevor from Media Mementos and Jason from Jason Entertainment for being guest narrators on this video. Links to their respective channels will be located in the description. If you come from either of these channels, feel free to let us know in the comments. We appreciate their work. Thanks for watching.